Happy Friday, and thanks for tuning in to radiofreerhinecliff.org and this show in particular. Correct me if I'm Norm. I'm your host, Norm, and I'm thrilled to be here today with Dr. Lynne Haney, professor from NYU. Hi, Lynne. Thanks for coming.
Hi, Norm. Thank you for having me.
Lynne is a professor of sociology at NYU. She's a sociologist, feminist scholar, and ethnographer of the state. We'll talk about that later. And has a brand new book out, and it's called Prisons of Deb T. Now, who is Deb T, and why can't you use her surname?
Everything had to be anonymous. You know, when you do social research, it's confidentiality.
Yeah. All right. It's actually called
It would
Prisons.
be debt.
Prisons of Debt. Oh, the afterlives of incarcerated fathers. And it's really incredibly interesting topic. I read the introduction and sort of skimmed the rest of it. But it's just mind-boggling, so much research. How did you get onto this topic?
So I've been studying the state, as you said. I'm an ethnographer of the state, and gender in the state in particular for, I would say, like my whole career, and have done it mostly through the lens of women. Mm-hmm. And about 10 years ago, I had a fellowship at NYU Law School, and it was actually a global fellowship. There were scholars that worked on issues of punishment and prisons from all over the world, and we were all there together for the year. And there was a guy that came in to give a talk. He was one of the heads of the Fortune Society, which is a reentry program, actually the biggest reentry program, prison reentry program in New York City. And he was formerly incarcerated. And so in the intro to his talk in this workshop, he said when he got out of prison, he owed $200,000 in child support debt. And as we were all sitting at the table, all the Europeans in particular looked over at me, which they always did whenever something outrageous from America, the U.S. happened, like, what the actual F? And I was like, oh, no. There was a mistake. You misheard that, right? I was like, no, he didn't say 200,000. So after the talk, I went and I did some research, and I found out that he did indeed owe $200,000 of debt. So there was egg all over my face with my colleagues, and I thought, my God, I need to understand how that could possibly happen, how somebody who's coming out of prison could owe that kind of money for their children. And so that was 10 years ago. It pretty much took me about 10 years to figure it out, Norm. The child support system is enormously complicated, especially as it merges with criminal justice. And so it meant going through all kinds of laws. And of course, every state has their own set of policies and their own jurisprudence around this. So it just took an enormous amount of time. And as an ethnographer of the state, I don't ever just read policies. I actually have to go and understand how they're enacted. So I went into courtrooms and I did interviews. So that's that kind of long story, or the research story of how it took 9 years to figure that out.
I want to get back to some of that, but you just said just now you went into courtrooms, and it says in the book you had direct observation of over 1,200 child support hearings.
Indeed.
Now, was that you, or do you have research assistants?
All me. Can you believe it? I'm a little strange, and some people would say a little OCD about my research. I don't like to share it with other people. Have my students do it. So that's part of the multi-year aspect of it. It was in 3 states: New York, California, and Florida. I did all the observations. And actually, I just made all those observations public because I had federal funding to do this research. And so as part of the federal funding, I had to publicize, I had to make some of my data available to the public. It was state funding. And so I just released it in Syracuse has a qualitative data repository, and I put all 1,200 observation of the cases in that repository. So it's out there. Is
there any downside to sharing that with everybody?
There is. I mean, I did it. It's mine kind of feeling. But there's also, there's a sense I'm not really quite sure how it can be used. Right. I was very careful, back to the Deb T, to protect confidentiality. And those kinds of things. But, once it's out there, it can be used in all kinds of complicated ways in court cases, by journalists. Social scientists are we like to control things, and we,
Right.
especially me, I said I do all my research, right? So you do lose a lot of control when you make things public. But that's also the importance of it. Is I scratched the surface in this book of those 1,200 cases, and so I like the idea that all of the kind of depth and complexity is out there that I couldn't even get into in the book.
All the depth, and you say you scratch the surface, but the depth and complexity is out there. In as much as all the research.
Literally, it's hundreds of pages of case notes from.
And so you recorded them, I guess, and had some service transcribe it?
Oh, you can't. So I did that for the interviews. But, the thing about courts, most courts, but especially child support courts, is they don't let you go in with any recording device of any sort. They don't allow you to use phones. I couldn't use my computer. So those were all handwritten notes.
Yes.
That I then I transcribed myself because they were handwritten and nobody could really follow my handwriting. And also judges were weird. I mean, I observed probably over 60 judges.
Right.
And judges put different constraints on the research. And some of them, required that I not use their names. Other ones required that I use their names.
Oh, God.
So one of the most infamous judges in my book, infamous in the sense that he was definitely the most punitive and arguably unconstitutional with more or less everything he did. He, not surprisingly, he came from Florida, rural Florida. He actually required that I use his real name in the book because he was so proud of what he was doing.
His hard line.
To these deadbeats, damn it.
Right.
Yeah, anyway. So
Oof.
That's oof.
Deadbeats. Now, one of the points you make several times in the book is the social stigma. And, like the moniker deadbeats and, all of these things. And these guys get out of prison with an average of like $36,000 of debt or something from non-payment of child support, which they can't make any money while they're in prison, and then the interest accrues.
Right.
And the social stigma just seems like this extra punitive layer on top of it.
So it's super important to just sort of preface the whole discussion of the work with, I only studied the public child support system. So there are always people out there that goes, well, my husband was a rich lawyer and he didn't pay, right? So I didn't look at any of those people. I only looked at people whose cases were adjudicated through the state, which is what we would call Title IV
Where's
programs.
the rich lawyer's case adjudicated?
They're in a different system. They're in not the Title IV state system. They're usually done between private lawyers. And so the state, this is the part of the child support system I looked at.
What's Title IV?
Title IV is part of the Social Security Act. It was created for the state to oversee the adjudication of child support for poor people mostly.
Okay.
So you can go if you need help. I mean, it's not that some middle class people end up there, but you can either, if you have a public assistance case, which I'm sure we'll talk about later, which is required that it end up in the Title IV system. Or if you seek the help of the state in some way, you can't get, you want the state's help in enforcing a child support order or setting one. You go to your local state child support office and you seek their help. Then you're in the state system. But most of upper middle class folks don't even enter this system. It's about 60% of child support cases are in this part of the system, the public system. There's a whole other part. So not only did I just look at Title IV cases, but within that, my real focus was on the incarcerated fathers. Now, that said, I have a chapter, and I could say a lot about just poor fathers, because mostly the policies that I talk about apply to both just poor men and incarcerated fathers. But the focus of the book and of the analysis is on men who go to prison and accumulate, like you just mentioned, gigantic child support debt,
So
and on average of $36,000. And so back to what you were asking about the deadbeat, one of the main points of the book is really to demystify that term, and to really sort of argue that it's almost impossible not to become that. That this system is so vast and so broad and so deep that it's almost impossible, if you're in this part of the system, not to enter into massive debt.
Right.
Because of what you just said about, if you're incarcerated, in most states, your child support still accrues. Again, this is very varied across states.
Can you explain that in more depth, sort of the mechanics, the financial mechanics of
Well, it's just, it's a mess in terms of the different states, but you would in New York State, for instance, you would have to contact a child support office to get and this is also new that you can even do this, is only in the past couple of years. If you're in prison, you have to contact the local child support office and ask them to set your order at 0 while you're in prison. But to do that, you have to have access to legal documents, you have to have access to a notary, you have to have all these legal resources to do that. New York is the best case scenario where you can even do that. In the majority of states,
set your order?
You can't even set your order. So if you go into prison with a child support order, right,
okay,
it's clear you can't pay it when you're in prison,
right?
So in the overwhelming majority of states, it's like, well, tough luck. It's just going to continue to accrue while you're in prison. There's nothing you can do about it. In several states, and it's only recent, you can, if you have the wherewithal and the knowledge and the legal know-how, you can contact a lawyer or a child support office and get it set at 0. And again, this is if you come in with a child support order. If you come in and you have kids and there's an order. California, New York, a couple other states will allow you to freeze the order while you're in prison. But
freeze it. It doesn't wipe it out.
Oh, it doesn't wipe it out. It just freezes it.
Gotcha.
But also, and this is sort of research that I'm doing now, only a tiny minority of prisoners actually do that because they don't know about it. They don't have access to any, the ability to do it. So it's about 30 to 40% of prisoners who are eligible to freeze their orders actually have them frozen.
Right.
So that's part of the book, and there's a whole chapter on that, is how this debt in prison just accumulates to really uncollectible and unimaginable levels. And hence, back to your question about the deadbeat, how it's almost impossible not to become a deadbeat. Because then on top of the accumulation, the kind of technical thing of the order is still accruing, you're in prison, you can't pay it. Obviously, you're making, cents. If you're lucky, if you get a prison job, you're making cents, a couple cents an hour. There's, as you mentioned this in passing, but there's interest that's charged on the debt. On top of whatever's accruing, there's that debt is accruing interest. And so in New York State, it's 9% interest.
Yes.
On the child support.
So
in some states like California, it's 10. Yeah. So, the system, and that's the whole first part of the book, is I just outline the kind of system of accumulation and how it's really a perfect storm of debt for all poor parents, this Title IV system.
Right.
But when it comes to incarcerated parents, it's like a tsunami of debt.
Right.
It's like impossible to not be overtaken with it or by it.
And that doesn't serve the families. I mean, the moms who presumably or hopefully are not incarcerated themselves out there with the kids,
right,
not getting any money from the dads who are in prison, have no wherewithal to give them money.
Exactly.
I mean, it's terrible for the families too.
It's terrible for the families. And the other sort of issue related to the families is that what we're talking about here is what I call private debt. So debt between the custodial parent and the non-custodial parent, right? But about 40% of child support debt is actually between the non-custodial parent and the state and the government. And it's always surprising to me that Americans don't know this. And again, I didn't. So before I started this, I didn't really know it either. But quote unquote welfare. So TANF, Medicaid, foster care, and in some states, food stamps. Those state programs get charged to non-custodial parents as child support. So I'll repeat that. Public assistance, quote unquote welfare, is charged to mostly fathers as child support, even when they're in prison. And so they come out, and about 40 to 50% of their debt is actually not owed to mothers, it's owed to states. And that also accrues interest, by the way. So
when they're out, I mean, they're trying to pay down sort of the capital of this debt, and good luck. But who does the state get their take first, and then the family second?
It depends on the state. So all of this is very state specific, right? Many state, very often a parent will have had an informal arrangement with the custodial parent before they go to prison. And
what do those
so
look
there
like?
is no, like I'll pay you $100 a week, or, we're not going to use the Title IV office. We're not going to go into into the state system. We're just going to work it out ourselves. The father gets incarcerated, and the mother then needs assistance. So she ends up going, or the family ends up going on public assistance. And very often that triggers a new case, a new public assistance case. In New York, that starts at $0. So they don't, but most other states will charge public assistance even when somebody is incarcerated. So in many cases when they get out, they're just owing the state. It's not a question of owing the mother and the state. They're just owing the state. And that money can be garnished up to 65% of their wages upon release.
Yeah, it's good luck getting back on your feet.
On your feet, exactly. It's really...
Well, so this...
And I can't even tell you, there were countless cases in court where I've seen, guys come out of prison, fathers come out of prison, and doing everything right, finding work, finding housing with usually relatives, getting it together, and then getting their first paycheck, and half of their wages, which are already minimal, right?
Right.
Were garnished by the state. And so they would go to court saying, oh, there must be a mistake. My baby mama or whatever doesn't have an order. And it's like, oh no, but you actually owe welfare debt. And so it's just like this, I can't, the reaction is everything from total resignation on the part of fathers to rage, to anger, to just, are you kidding me? Is this system set up for me to fail? And that is often what it feels like.
It does. It does seem like it's kind of set up to fail. Yeah. Who's making the money off of this? What does New York State make off of this?
I don't know New York State in particular. So what do you mean this? So
well, they're getting they're first in line for the payback of the interest that's being accrued and the penalties.
Well, so they're different right? So there's the public assistance payback, and that goes whatever is paid, and honestly, Norm, about 5 to 10% of that gets paid every year. It's tiny. It just accrues as debt. I mean, fathers can't pay that, and so it just continues to build. And it goes on until the grave, I guess, and then it's erased. Yeah, I mean, I saw. I interviewed people, or I saw one guy, and I begin the second part of the book with this case of a father in Los Angeles who owed $500,000 in child support debt for kids who were in their 30s and 40s, and he had just had a heart attack, and he phoned in for the hearing because he wanted his driver's license back, and the judge was like, $500,000. So she quickly computed what an interest-only payment on that debt would be, because in California they charge 10% interest on $500,000. So the judge quickly computes this and says, oh my goodness, the interest-only payment on this debt is over $2,000. Just the interest.
A month.
So the guy next to me turns to me and goes like, that's like a mortgage. And I was like, yeah, it is. I mean, it's like this poor guy's mortgage was to the state of California. So I go back to what is the it part, right? There are so many different types of debt, and that's what it took me so long to figure out when I wrote this book, right? There's debt to families, and even the debt to the state is of different forms, right? Some of it is public assistance payback. It's payback for welfare, quote unquote. And of that, who benefits? About 90% is share of that money that comes back is shared by the federal government and the state government, and about 10% goes to families. Right. And every year, that amount nationally is about $4 billion. That's taken in a public assistance payback by states and shared between the states and the federal government. It's a lot of money. And that could be money that could go to families if the state didn't need to be paid back. And there's currently one state in the country that essentially gives what's ever paid on public assistance payback back to families. So it's called a pass-through. So most states... That
sounds good.
It is good.
Who does that?
That would be Colorado. Isn't that interesting? So not all states, most states have some pass-through amount. And that was created in the 90s to encourage parents to pay public assistance payback, because otherwise if the whole amount went to the state, why would I pay anything? So most states like New York, it's like $100. The first 100 will go to the families, and then the rest goes to the state. So there are
something.
It's something, but it's not. I mean, it's not going to.
When did this Title IV? Is that what you said? When did that?
That was the 1970s when the federal government got involved in child support. So that's the kind of origin story, which is a bit before the federal government got involved. It was like, state level, local level, incredible, inequalities and injustices were going on in child support. So the federal government comes in to even out a lot of the injustices and to even out the variations across locales and states. And so that's the creation of Title IV, this public part of the child support system.
And like lots of government programs, they thought, this is going to help make things better. And it's just turned into a nightmare.
I mean, I don't know if it's a nightmare. I mean, I wouldn't go that far. I think it in many ways it does good. I think child support is an incredibly important issue. I think it's an incredibly important program. I think there are millions and millions of women and children who are supported by it, and they need it, especially in a moment where public assistance has dried up across the country. So this is not a book, an anti-child support book in any sense or analysis. It is rather when child support merges with criminal justice, and that's when things get destructive.
Right.
When child support becomes a mode of punishment and not actually a mode of family support. Because alongside the system of accumulation that we've been talking about, which is itself punishing, right? When you have that kind of debt, that is a form of punishment. It's a form of confinement when you can't get credit. You can't have your driver's license back because you're indebted. You can't get any kind of loan. You have to, you can't open a bank account because if you open a bank account, your accounts can be seized because there can be liens. So that is punishing in and of itself. But there's a whole other system that has emerged alongside of this accumulation system, and it's an enforcement system that is relatively new, and and that's really where you see the merging of criminal justice and child support. And that is what I think is destructive, not child support itself. Child support is incredibly important.
Right.
Without it, we would have so much more poverty.
If they get it.
If they get it, and if the government doesn't get its hands on it. I mean, I use a term that, very often that, there are deadbeat states. So all of our focus on deadbeat dad obscures the way that so many states act as deadbeats by seizing the tiny bit of money that families need and intercepting it all over the country.
Yes. All right.
I'm sorry. It's like
it's so much, and and there's so many issues like this out there.
That's the problem,
that's a problem. So what can be done?
Well, what can be done? I mean, we haven't even talked about the enforcement aspects of it, right? Which is the criminalization, which is really,
well, then let's go through that. And
a couple $100 in debt, you get your driver's license suspended. You see people being put in jail for debt, for child support debt. I'm on a legal case right now where we're challenging the constitutionality of incarcerating parents for debt. It's the only form of debt. The judge that I mentioned, the Florida judge that I talked about, he liked to tell people this all the time. Child support debt, and he had like a southern accent even though he's from Florida, is the only type of debt that can get you put in jail. And it is. And so I'm on a legal case right now where we're challenging the constitutionality of that because debtors' prisons were outlawed decades ago, but not when it comes to this form of debt. So what can be done there? I mean, it depends on what issue we're trying to address. And, it's kind of an interesting thing because in a way it's so complicated, yet it's so simple. Like there are when I wrote this and I wrote the conclusion really to be almost like optimistic because the depth and the scope of the problem is real, but the policy solutions are very clear. And there are a few just critical things that can happen that will certainly change. And they're not that hard. The accumulation, like the public assistance payback. You just pass through 100%. States need to do that across the board.
Right.
They should not be intercepting any money that poor men pay in child support to poor families. And that would be the Title IV case, right?
Right. But if the states are making billions of dollars on this.
Billions of dollars on it. And that's the problem. And the feds are too.
Right.
And so states will say back is we can't afford, we're going through this right now in California because there's a bill that is going through, that may end up passing through in California.
You say
100%.
We're going through that.
Well, I'm advising some people on it, right? I mean, they're really the ones well, right now we actually had two bills in California that got through the state legislature 2 years ago, right before COVID, that lifted public assistance payback and also lifted the interest rate in California. We had to go through twice, and I was quite involved in that. I testified in the California legislature.
But who's the we? What groups are organizing?
Well, so
to
there
fight
is a
this?
big group so it's interesting. New York is not all that organized, and but in California, there's a group of 50 organizations called Truth and Justice and Child Support. It organized really in this legislative fight that I just mentioned, and they're doing fantastic things in California. And so we did, and I was sort of part of that. I was sort of, a minor part of it. But we testified, and we got both legislative branches in California to agree to this. And then the governor ended up vetoing it at the last minute. And so now the bills. And so now they're going through really the budget. And so it looks like in California, I don't want to jinx it, so I don't want to say too much about it, but they're probably going to pass 100% pass through in California. If that happens, then we can sort of shame other states, right? When a big state like California but back to what my point was, which was policymakers in California will say, well, we can't afford it because if we do this, we still have to pay the federal part of the payback, right? So the states can pass through their part. But that means that the states are having to pay the federal government their 45% because the feds have not relinquished their part of.
But again, like sort of shaming it up the chain.
The chain, exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. So California does it, and maybe New York will do it.
Right.
Big states, and these are the two biggest arrear states, i.e., the states with the biggest amount of debt. If they're willing to do that. That would be the first step, and that is simple. If they do that, there are billions of dollars that will flow back into to help families, billions of dollars that will be lifted off of poor fathers who can't pay it. It's uncollectible debt. And by the way, it's billions of dollars that will be lifted from state budgets, right? It's not good for state budgets to have so much uncollectible debt on the books, right? Currently in the United States, there's $116 billion in child support debt. It's like, that's not collectible. So let's start finding ways of forgiving, of canceling. It's a parallel to, not a complete parallel, to college debt, to loan debt, right?
Right.
So that it's a very simple. So your question that I've gone on rambled about, what can we do? I mean, lifting the public assistance payback is the simplest policy reform. The other one is interest. Interest, and I have a number of charts in the book about you've seen debt soar in states that charge interest because they charge compound interest.
Right.
Right. That's regularly computed on $36,000 on average of debt. And I do these debt simulations in the book where I show what happens to that debt in a state with interest and without interest. And it just balloons with interest.
Oof.
Sorry, kind of a Debbie Downer. And your show was always so happy, and I feel like
it used to be.
But
Thanks,
this day,
Lynne.
which we should talk about, this is a day of mourning, and
oh my God,
in general.
Yeah, this is a day where ever since 10:15 this morning, I was like, okay, I need a fucking drink, and you brought some drinks.
I brought some Manhattan.
10:15. That's when the Supreme
Manhattan,
Court actually announced that they're doing away with Roe v. Wade. Oh. We'll get to that later, but what do we have? What do we have to drink?
We have a Manhattan.
Oh, good.
I'm coming in from Manhattan, sort of Brooklyn, Manhattan. Yes.
I've heard of Brooklyn, Manhattan.
Yeah.
All right. Well, do you want me to shake it up and pour it out for people?
Yeah, it's good. We're going to be strong. You need it. I mean, given what happened today at 10:15, I'm going to be honest. Like, I kind of didn't feel right coming in and talking about fathers, today. Well, I felt like this was not the moment to talk about poor,
I mean, there's a lot of overlap, right? I mean, fathers, women, families, and this debt thing really affects families a lot.
Absolutely. And it's something that I've been wary to talk about, but because the end of Roe is really the end of freedoms for women and an assault on our very basic rights and liberties. But it will have spillover effects onto men, especially poor men, and the men that I'm writing about and I'm talking to.
All right, before we get to your next downer topic.
No, I know.
Cheers.
Positive.
Thanks for bringing this. Here's
Thank
to,
you.
as I used to say, here's to better days.
Yeah.
Because today was not one of them.
I don't know if it's going to get much better. Was it really?
Oh, that's
Good.
yummy. Yum. Thank you, Dr. Lynne Haney.
Thank you. For inviting me.
So you were just saying, we talked about this a little bit before, and there was a line in your book. It goes without saying that women shoulder the familial burdens brought on by mass incarceration and impoverishment. And it's really easy to see why. And now today, there's this other sort of assault on women. And, it's, for me anyway, it's hard to not sort of become a conspiracy theorist. Like, why is the patriarchy like so keen on keeping women down?
Yeah.
And why are they so keen? Because on the abortion issue, mostly it's white women who were having the abortions. So there's a theory. I don't know if you've seen this. You probably don't see all the conspiracy theories.
No, I don't. I don't do social media, so I don't.
There you
Safe
go.
space.
You need to get on Facebook so you can see
all
some
the
of this.
Conspiracies.
That it's part of this like white, superiority thing that people don't want the white population to diminish. And so if they take away abortion rights, there's going to be more white babies.
Okay, that actually
crazy.
literally makes no sense. I mean, because the states are the spaces where women won't have access to abortion are not white spaces.
Yeah.
And this is, I really feel like this is yet another attack on women of color and poor women,
Yeah.
disadvantaged women and marginalized women. The white women that you're referring to will always have resources.
Right. That's a good point.
To protect their reproductive rights. And that is, I mean, I don't know if it's the patriarchy. I saw that you had an abortion a sign as we came in.
Yeah.
65% of Americans, if not more, are pro-choice or they're pro-RV Wade.
Yeah.
Right. So this is a small sector of the country that's hijacked this, and it's very similar to the topic of the book. Right. It's a small sector, and unlike abortion, part of the ways that the policies that I'm writing about continue is people don't know about them. Right? It's absolute ignorance. Like, who knew that the governor of California didn't realize that public assistance got paid back by non-custodial parents? The governor didn't know that, right? I mean, this is not outing Newsom. He's a good guy. It's just that these, there are layers and layers of complexity that obscure what's going on. And so if anything positive from today, and I feel like there's nothing positive, but at least it's been uncovered. Right? There's nothing is obscure about what's being done to women today. Right? It's right out there. And Thomas couldn't have been any clearer about who's next. Right? Who's now going to be on the chopping block.
What did he say?
Well, yeah. He said that, it is totally absurd to base the withdrawal of Roe on the argument that the Constitution didn't mention abortion, right? That is so absurd, because if that is the logic and that is the argument and justification, then all of these rights that we know, right, from contraception to gay marriage, and Thomas said that, bring it on. Well, but even more, what about, Brown v. Board of Education? Wait, I mean, the drafters of the constitutions were slave owners. They weren't thinking of desegregation. Does that mean that desegregation is now going to be on all of those laws, right? If that's the logic,
or AK-47s, that's the Constitution didn't mention them.
Horrifying. Yeah, exactly. And that's okay yesterday, right?
Oh, yesterday. Concealed carry.
Okay.
Was yesterday's thing. I think it was New York, but I imagine that's a national issue.
It's concealed carrying. That was okay.
Yeah.
Right? Because the drafters of the Constitution were definitely looking out for our ability to conceal and carry. But abortion,
carry a pistol
no,
in your pocket.
No, they weren't thinking of that. I mean, it's absurd.
So do you
But at least it's exposed, right? At least it's there. Like, so we just now need to fight for it. I mean, we just need to all get mobilized. And
well, what does that look like, fighting for this? We're talking about Roe now, right?
yeah, well, who knows? Whatever. Fight for what?
I mean, yeah. I mean, can they? I don't even know. I mean, the Supreme Court could hear it again
Oh, they won't hear it on these terms?
but on different
So
terms.
the argument is that
years
there
down.
should be another, there could be another constitutional basis for it. Equal protection is the most obvious. Or the other one is that we'll just, get a federal legislation through. That's, yeah.
That doesn't seem likely, does it?
Well,
Not
no.
now. Yeah, everybody's
it's
shaking.
not.
Everybody's
It's
shaking their head no.
But yeah, not for a while at least. Not
Yeah.
for a while. But it doesn't mean we can't fight. Even if, there are always pressure points, right? And you just keep pounding away.
Where do you
those
suspect the pressure
points.
points might be on this debate?
I think it's. I think young folks. That's really my hope. That I think when I look at my students, like they just took this right so for granted. And even though we all told them, us old folk, that there was a time, right, when this wasn't, you didn't have bodily integrity, and you didn't have these rights. It was sort of an abstraction. And I think now it's no longer an abstraction. And so I think that's my hope, is that the younger generation will be really mobilized by this.
Shit's getting real.
Shit's getting real now, And yeah. And that generation is so incredible in the way that they're deconstructing the things that my generation had a hard time deconstructing, right?
Example?
We get mirrored in, nuclear family, and all this, gender, binaries, and they're like intersectional in the way they breathe feminism. So my generation had to fight to think about gender, race, class, sexuality, all those things is interconnected. My undergraduates, it's just how they view the world. They can't imagine disentangling any of those things. And I think that's incredibly optimistic and hopeful, that they'll be able to challenge things in ways that won't get mirrored in the obstacles that we got stuck in, like arguing for abortion around privacy issues, which is a very middle class logic, right? Doing it around equal protection and equity and justice and reproductive justice issues, not privacy, right? I should be allowed to be private.
I never even heard that for the privacy thing.
Well, that's the basis of abortion. That's how Roe was argued, and
I don't think I ever knew that. Like what happens in my home is my business,
and that's why on the chopping block next, Thomas is saying, yeah, bring contraception, yeah, bring gay sex even, forget about right, gay marriage, all those things, right? A lot of those were also around privacy. And that is arguably a very middle class, upper middle class logic. There's a whole other movement on, reproductive justice, seeing the social economic costs and so and complexities of abortion, not just abortion though, maternal, mortality rates, all those things, talking about them all together. So anyway, I mean, it's possible that this will then lead to a movement around that reproductive justice issue. And back to this, that may even think about men too as reproductive actors, which is I can't believe
really?
I'm even saying that.
Are they?
It's a feminist. I'm like, oh, what did I say?
No,
let's not talk about that.
well, so if the privacy argument is like this upper middle class thing, then certainly somebody's taking it for like the masses of the class. And what's their argument look like?
What do you mean? This is about?
You said that the privacy argument for Roe is an upper middle class stance.
Okay.
I'm saying
it's possible that the logic of privacy, right? And that is something that we hold near and dear, right? That there are certain that is a privilege to even think of oneself as being private
It's a privileged point of view.
Exactly.
But
And so there are other ways of thinking about reproductive issues around justice, equity, equal access, right? And those are often run counter to arguments about privacy. It's my private life. Stay out of my private life, rather.
Right.
That there are adverse effects for certain groups of doing certain kinds of restrictions around bodily rights.
Right.
Yeah. And it's sort of, to get back to the child support issue, it is the tension often that I find with the work, that when people read my work, they're like, and I get hate mail all the time, but it's very often from upper middle class women who are like, well, my husband doesn't pay it, and my husband, and it's like, yeah, I'm not talking about those guys, right? And we have to begin to make a distinction.
Which seems very obvious in your book, that
It's
you're not
so
talking
obvious,
about those.
I know.
I mean, even the title, Prisons of, it's debt, I guess, Prisons of Debt.
You know.
The Afterlives of Incarcerated Fathers. It's pretty clear who you're talking about.
It is, but this is such a painful, fraught topic for so many people. And it's fraught with gender and race and class. All this stuff gets mixed up. And so people will often just take from their own experiences. And it's often, for a lot of people, it's emotional. It's about trauma. It's about, being, when relationships end, it's often a toxic mix of rage and hurt feelings. And so a lot of people don't distinguish between, I'm writing about poor men and their, ex-husbands in like a Lexus, right?
Yeah.
I don't
fucking John is a dick.
Right. And he's not paying, and he's a dick. And he should pay.
So you say hate mail, I'm guessing it's hate email mostly.
Exactly, yeah. I use that broadly, yeah.
They somehow find your email address online.
It's not hard. And I did an op-ed
hard.
a couple years ago in the LA Times, and that was a big one.
And they put your email on it?
No, they just put my name on it and where I was from. But that was about we haven't even touched this. There are raids that police departments do to get deadbeat dads, right, quote unquote, and they do them on Father's Day. And so 3 years ago,
that is just so fucked up.
It's so beyond fucked up. It's like they literally do them because men are out with their kids. They come out of hiding
to do this in front of their kids to traumatize them as well.
Yep. I begin the book with the man who that happened to in Florida.
Yeah.
Ronnie. And he came out for a family barbecue on Father's Day, and he claims, I mean, I obviously wasn't there, that the cops were just, driving up and down the street looking for guys who possibly had warrants. So they're, New Jersey does them in large numbers. They just do sweeps of parks and stuff on Father's Day. And what they're doing, by the way, is they're just looking for warrants. And so they'll walk up to you and they'll be like, hey, Norm Magnusson, like, pull out your, let me see. And they'll do a check and see if you have a warrant. And if you do, they'll bring you in. And that is the other kind of motivation for this study was, I don't know if you remember Walter Scott, who in many ways was the first sort of icon of BLM, was, I think it was in 2017 or 16, when he was in South Carolina running from the cops, a routine traffic stop. His headlight was out, right?
Yeah.
They pull him over, and he ran. Right. And I mean, we were all perplexed by why would he run? It's just a damn headlight. Right. But he ran. And he ran because he had a child support warrant. And he knew he was going back to jail for that warrant. And the cop shot him in the back as he was running away. And so that was the first kind of like visual, a phone caught it. You remember this? I mean, it was and the sort of child support aspect of it was sort of not to discuss, but it was not lost on me and many other people were like, wow. And how could that be? And now I understand when I see, since then it's a very common thing, right? With capturing people running from the cops for traffic stops. And I always go, yeah, I have a feeling I know what they're running from.
And you're like, yeah, I get it.
Get it. I totally get it. Yeah.
So 10 years ago, you were at this conference. Somebody was talking, dropped the $200,000 figure. And all of the foreigners at your table were like, what the fuck? You Americans are so lame. And you looked into it and discovered it was true and got interested in this topic. I'm curious, in academic life, what happens next? What gets you up to, you do a little bit of research, I'm guessing, and then think, okay, this is really rich, and then you apply for grants or.
Oh, you want to like the trajectory of a
how does it go?
project? Yeah, I mean, I was sort of lucky with this one in that usually it takes a while to get funding together.
But don't skip the intermediate steps.
Oh, no, I'm going to go back.
Okay.
Don't worry, I'm going to go back. But I was lucky in the sense that I sort of was like, shit, someone has to study this and they got to study it right. So in my opinion, right means looking at actual people and people's experience and talking to people and getting into courts and not just quantifying things. So there have been a ton of quantitative stuff done, but that didn't tell me anything about, and a lot of analysis of policy, right, on the books. Didn't tell me like how the system actually worked. So I thought someone needs to do this correctly. And so I was lucky in the sense that very early, like I really knew almost nothing about child support. I applied for an NSF grant and National Science Foundation, and just had this sort of all the stars aligned. And there was a committee that was like, this needs to be studied, and they funded me, and a lot. It was a lot of money, and they also it was co-sponsored with NIJ, National Institute of Justice.
And so you're in
legitimacy, right? Because the NIJ was interested in it, and that's the government, right?
Right.
So yeah.
And so your proposal to them was basically this book?
Well, it was actually ironic. It was a smaller version of that book, but yes, it was.
Right.
It was not 1,200 cases. It was like, I'm going to go have a quick look at child support cases, and then the first court hearings I went into, I literally could not believe what I was seeing. I was like, wait a fucking minute, I've never seen anything like this before. I mean, the kinds of violations of constitutional rights and privacy, I was astonished, and I thought no one's touched this. So I think it was mostly an interview study, which I did. I mean, I interviewed 145 formerly incarcerated fathers. That was a project I pitched to them, and doing a few hearings in these 3 states. I couldn't get myself out of the courts once I started.
Right.
I just literally, as someone who does work in law, I couldn't believe that law was working like this. It's like a no man's land of law.
Right.
And it has subsequently, that's been confirmed. So I've talked to journalists, I've been interviewed by many journalists about this, and I always tell them, okay, you don't believe what I'm describing because it's so bad. Just go to your local child support, court and see. And just over and over again, people are just horrified by what goes on because there are no legal protections. People are taken to jail because I don't like the way you're looking at me, because I don't like the way you're sitting. You're going to jail. You're a deadbeat.
You used to be killed for looking at somebody wrong.
Right. Well, but in court, in 2019,
way back when.
Yeah.
So
and things are said to these men that could never be said to any other group. And that floored me.
Right.
So back to the kind of trajectory of, I just went on kind of rogue on that piece.
Did you interviewed 145 guys? Was that prior to the NSF grant?
No, that was the NSF
after
grant.
NSF.
That was
before
NSF.
NIJ.
And that was also really, really hard. I mean, so these guys don't want to be detected, right? I mean, part of the thing about them is that they're for good reason. They're overly surveyed. They're overly punished, right? They try to lay low in child support, not talking about their criminal justice histories, and in the penal system, they're not talking about child support. So it was not easy to get them to trust me at all. I'm a white woman. It was the gender and race politics were as much about the research than they were about the topic.
Let me just stop. Overly surveyed? You mean like all the scientists?
Surveyed. No, the state. Surveyed. Yeah, okay. Not surveyed.
Oh, surveilled.
Surveilled.
Gotcha.
Surveyed too.
Gotcha.
Actually surveyed too. But,
yes.
Not,
I didn't.
Not actually spoken to. And that's actually, in my opinion, the power of this is that, and I didn't anticipate this, that, these were men who were incredibly emotional about all kinds of things. They just got out of prison. They had enormous debt. They had, all the complexities of returning to families and kids. But they are so rarely addressed as fathers.
Right.
They're all kinds of things. They're not fathers. And so that's what I did. I was like, I want to hear and I want to listen to you.
Right. You say early on in the book, these men are you quote somebody, Lamar, who says, these men are like runaway slaves. Former indebted father turned social advocate said, so in that book you're writing, you need to show them as human.
As human, yeah. And that just meant listening. It just meant listening. And obviously...
And faithfully reporting. And
Yeah, but I mean, in the actual like research part, it meant listening.
Right.
And interestingly, so in the kind of NSF grant I wrote, I was like, oh, I'm just going to be in courts to get the guys to interview, right? I'm going to approach them when they're in court, and then I'm going to interview them. Oh, yeah, right. Nobody in court wanted to talk to me. Like, they wanted fucking out of there. They associated me with court. So I got maybe a couple interviews through court. I had to do work it. I mean, I worked constantly, but, you know, so we could talk forever, and then we have much more time about the kind of complexities of, you know, of gender, race, class, all kinds of generation, location, when you're doing interviews across so many differences. I mean, I'm a white woman interviewing. You know, I would say
nobody knew that on the radio until just now.
Right. Okay. So I am. I bet they could tell. I think I mentioned it before. And I'm interviewing a majority of men of color, not all men of color, but a majority of men of color.
Right.
And the whole race issue here is also very, very prominent. Yeah, go ahead.
So I'm guessing a lot of these guys, people, you said it was just about listening to them. And I'm guessing a lot of them, you know, people had listened to them, but maybe not really heard them, or they'd not felt that they'd been heard.
They didn't even listen to them, Norm. Like, they didn't ask them, like, what was it like to... So this will be... Because, you know, so we were talking about the state politics of this. The other, I think, theme of this book really is about fatherhood and redemption and forgiveness. And these men were really just wanting to be spoken to and heard as fathers who were in a lot of pain.
So now they're coming up to you, and you're asking and listening, and I'm guessing...
No, I'm coming up to them.
Empathizing.
I had to convince them, like, please sit down with me.
You're empathizing with their situation, and they, some of them must have been very touched by this.
I don't want to exaggerate the effect of one interview. I think definitely many of them wrote me thank you notes. A majority would break down in the interviews because, again, they weren't used to having to reflect on themselves not as transgressive but as parents and as valuable caretakers and caregivers who their children need and their children's mothers need. And I emphasize that in my interviews. I asked them about that. I said, you know, I asked them, what is your proudest moment as a parent?
Right.
What are your moments of regret? And that's really painful. And I didn't, you know, this is so interesting that, and I didn't expect this to be the most powerful question when we spoke, but it always was towards the end of the interview, I asked them, who was the best father you ever knew? And it was sort of the conclusion of a whole section about fatherhood and what it meant to be in prison and parent in prison. And it was really incredible across the board. There was a silence always when I asked that. Like, and you could just sort of see that men looking for anybody, like, okay, no, not him. And it was a painful silence. It was a silence, like it wasn't a productive silence. It was like almost an anxious silence. And then very often they would just say no one, or sometimes they would say their kids, or there would be jokes like, well, Cosby maybe at some point, but not Cosby anymore, right? Like, or maybe Jay-Z. Is Jay-Z a good father? I don't know. Is he a good father? Like, they weren't even cultural icons so. During the silence, I would sort of break it and say, okay, you don't have to know the person. Maybe if it's a cultural, somebody in the culture, or like just sort of to relieve some of the tension. And even then, there were no fathers of color, fathers of disadvantaged backgrounds who they could point to and say, yeah, that culturally, I know him, and I want to be like him.
You can. And on some level, a lot of these...
Depressing again.
Way to go, Haney. But you talk about these guys, and so many of them, you talk about them wanting to be good fathers, wanting to step in, wanting to be present. And then, you know, you go to fucking Father's Day picnic, and boom, the cops come by. Yeah. And it's a perfect sort of metaphor for this whole prisons of debt thing.
Absolutely. I mean, so I read in the book, I had one chapter where I talk about the kind of sort of fatherhood on a continuum, right? And one chapter is on the extremes. Those fathers who, you know, are culturally adhere to what we see as good fathering, right? And many of them are the most disadvantaged fathers. They're fathers in homeless shelters. They're fathers who have had long histories of drug abuse, of incarceration, but they find ways of stepping up to be consistent and caring and loving to really vulnerable kids. And so I write about them as sort of the one end of men who not only want to, but find a way of coming through.
Right.
And then on the other end, men who are just what I call unapologetically absent, just are like,
Sure,
screw this, and I don't know, I couldn't.
And there's men
tell
like that of every socioeconomic strata. Yeah.
These guys are unapologetic about it, and they're pissed off, and I don't, it's unclear whether they came into the system like that, the system made them like that, but those guys are about 10%, by the way. They're not the overwhelming majority, the
Right.
unapologetically absent. But by the way, the really culturally iconic ones are only about 22. The overwhelming majority of men I interviewed were what I call cyclical. They would cycle in and out. They would have moments of like coming into their kids' lives. Usually when something good happened in their lives, they felt secure, they felt confident, they felt like they were proud of themselves. They wanted their kids to see them,
Right.
and connect to their kids. They were either making some money, they felt confident as parents, and so they would cycle into their kids' lives. And then, this goddamn system, usually when something would come down, they would get arrested, they would get a warrant, something would happen to derail them, and they would cycle out. And so
Right.
the overwhelming majority were moving in and out. And so those are the really painful cases, and the fathers that really would just break down because they were trying so hard, and yet were unable to be consistent with their kids. There were more, and by the way, those are the things that mothers complain about the most with these dads, right? They're not consistent. If they could just be one way or the other, either present or absent.
Right.
Let me navigate this, and I get it, right? I mean,
Sure.
but like that cyclical nature was very much part of what the system was producing in them. And that's the really tragic part of it, I think. The system being the child support system, was creating what it most feared in fathers.
So when the system becomes self-aware of this horrible cycle it's creating, well, it sounds like maybe, in California or Colorado, if they can get pass-through of like 100% or towards that,
Right,
that
well,
would be the system saying, hey, wait a minute, we've become a cancer on this.
We have, yeah. There are moments where, but the system, is like the patriarchy. It's so complex. It's full of so many layers, so many institutions, so many different people. So while some policymakers in a few states might get it, it's been years and decades of people that have grown up. They've aligned their economic and institutional interests with this system, and they're going to fight it. So even when you point these things out, and I have, so I've gone into the belly of the beast with this. So a couple of years ago, the Department of Justice, Trump's Department of Justice, and National Institute of Justice asked me to do a white paper on this topic for them. They wanted insight into how to solve this, and I, spent many months writing the white paper for them, and I did a webinar with them. And I've subsequently done several webinars with child support enforcement directors all over the country. And it's so interesting when you point this stuff out. What very often happens is people revert to federalism. They're like, oh, well, yeah, I mean, that happens over there, but it doesn't happen in New York, right? Yes. Or that's the constant refrain, right? So whenever I'll point something out, like I'll bring up a case in Florida, like I've done here. I've brought up multiple states. Well, we don't do that in Massachusetts. Well, okay, A, you do that in Massachusetts, but B, even if you don't, and it's happening in Florida, we all need to care, right? Because we are actually still a country. So that's very often what happens, but I sort of, I'm not sure we want to, maybe we're not, especially after today, maybe we don't want to be anymore. But so you're saying, like, when you do point it out, very often what happens is like, well, yeah, I mean, we don't do that here. Yeah,
right.
Thank God.
But some people, you said Gavin Newsom's like, what? Get the fuck out of here.
And he's to be his credit,
we do that here?
We do that here.
We need to
Absolutely. It's an
stop that.
epiphany. Exactly, and that's what keeps me going with this work, and that's why I'm doing work in Texas now, because it's pretty damn logical, right? When
Right.
you seize all this money from poor families, like it's back to what I said. The mission and the promise of child support evaporates when you add on this system of debt and the system of punishment.
When that is exactly the topic sense of your book.
There you go.
And
Look
also,
right back.
it's been an hour. So,
Oh my God, you're kidding. No.
No, I'm not.
I'm sorry.
Dr. Lynne
Can
Haney,
we just end on something
professor
light
of sociology.
because you're so happy.
No,
This show is so happy.
because this is the first time all day I'm not really pissed off about what happened this morning at 10:15.
Oh, good.
So thank
I'm
you.
glad I
Cheers
distracted
to
you.
that. Thanks for bringing the drinks. Thanks for coming up and
Thank you
talking
for
with
inviting me, Norm.
And thanks for fighting the good fight, because that's really what you're doing, and it's just beautiful. Thank you, because hopefully makes the world better for all of us. Hey, everybody, thanks for tuning in. Have a happy Friday. Good night. Have a great weekend. Bye.